Okay, let's see if I can give you a short version of the history of American social welfare. Hopefully, this lecture is not going to drag out too long. There's a lot of information I could share with you. I teach a whole semester on this particular topic for the introductory students, but I'll try to be a little more concise than that for you. I find that understand as you have noticed, and I think some of the things I've written in the Blackboard that understanding the social welfare system in the United States, whether it's intended to be this way or not, whether it's favorable for social welfare or not, in order to understand it, you really have to get the historic trends that were going on throughout the development of the social welfare program, particularly in the United States, where, as we've already talked about, so much of the character of our social welfare system comes and goes with the different political and economic trends and the different kinds of agencies that are capable and willing of providing assistance to some recipients, perhaps not all. And so it's as the authors tell us in chapter one, it's a very complicated history. And so, as I say, I'll try to do my best to be complete but concise. And so, first of all, just to briefly touch on what the underpinnings of our social welfare system is in the United States, there are two or three different things that really have a major impact upon social welfare here. One is its basis in Judeo-Christian teachings, and as the author points out, even in the early Judaic teachings, which really is the foundation for our sense of charity to those who are in need, there were still some restrictions and some expectations placed on the individuals who received charity in way ancient times. I think actually, the author traces it back to the days of Hammurabi and the Hammurabi Code, which frankly I've not really studied a whole lot, but it goes back a long way. Just rest to say, or suffice to say, the Christianity kind of brought this up to a new level, but really kind of connected to the Judaic teachings. Of course, that's where the foundation of Christianity is anyway. So, the sense of charity and the provision of relief for the poor really comes first from those religious underpinnings, I guess you would say, as well as cultural underpinnings. The feudal system also had something to do with this in that there was a tradition in feudal Europe where the serfs, those common men and women, let's say, who lived around the castle, around the manor of the wealthy lords with his army of knights, that the serfs depended very much upon the protection of the armies or the knights that the lords commanded, and so in exchange for that protection, they farmed and provided and did their crafts and different kinds of things, and provided the wealthy people with the fruits of their labor. And so they were farming on lands owned by the lords, but also received protection in exchange for that. The English poor laws were established after the feudal system broke up in Europe because the common man and woman, let's say, were released from the prisons. They weren't enslaved there, but that was their means of living. And so when the lords were no longer able or willing to provide for their protection and their care, and the serfs had to kind of hit the road more or less and find some place to live and some ways to get by. This was during a period of time when the early stages of industrialization was hitting Europe as well, and so the agrarian economy that I think Europe focused upon was also beginning to give way to other means of living, other means of production, and and also the introduction of the cash system in economics, rather than bartering and that kind of thing as had been dominant before that time. So these individuals moving around looking for a place to be and to earn a living were actually referred to as vagabonds. There's another term that's similar to that, that's vagrants, but I believe they called them vagabonds in those days, at least in English-speaking parts of Europe. This group, throughout time, the labels attached to them have been less than complimentary. Oftentimes, tramps and hobos today, very much so. These individuals today are the homeless that we're familiar with. But in any event, nobody seems to know, what's the best answer for homeless, and that this was true also back in the days of the English or the demise of the feudal system, I should say. And so the English poor laws were established essentially to give communities a sense of who was responsible for the care of these people who were wandering around, and what the communities were and were not responsible for. So it spelled out responsibilities for tending to the needy. And actually, some of the earliest community taxes were implemented, to provide the community with the means to care for these individuals. But there were also restrictions placed on these wanderers, such that if you didn't live in the community would not accept responsibility necessarily for your care. And so this was earliest use of residency requirement, which was something that we had in our own public welfare system for many years, until I think somewhere in the 70s that began to change in the United States. There was also a system of warning out, which basically told these wanderers when they came to a community that they had, X amount of time to move on, that they couldn't stay there, or they'd be, I don't know, incarcerated, I supposed. And the other thing was is that one thing that was surfacing during this period of time through these poor laws was that there was a differentiation made, perhaps for the first time, perhaps not, with the worthy and the unworthy poor. And the worthy poor were those individuals who were unable to work and unable to support themselves because of physical conditions or age, whether too young or too old, that kind of thing. Whereas what were considered unworthy poor were those able-bodied individuals who were not caring for themselves. Now, much like today, with our economic system and the industries kind of giving way to the service industry and everything, many people that previously were able to support themselves have difficulty doing that now. And so the changes in the economic system have something to do with poverty today. And it did also back in those days, because remember, an entire system of living, the feudal system, had dissipated, and now in the new industrial era or whatever, it was the economic systems changing that resulted in many people not being able to care for themselves. It isn't necessarily about the character of the individual. When colonists came to America and established laws, the early colonial laws regarding poverty and the homeless and such, really reflected the Elizabethan or English poor law system. And the earliest government of responsibility was the local community, the parish or town council, that was designated as being responsible for the residents and the care of those individuals who couldn't care for themselves. By the way, this slide refers to English poor laws. A lot of times you'll hear about the Elizabethan poor laws, especially of 1602, and I think the Elizabethan poor laws were the epitome or the apogee of those laws. That was the most famous, let's say, and the most codified. But poor laws preceded the Elizabethan poor laws, and so that's one of the reasons why the English poor laws is perhaps a little more inclusive. Just in case you're wondering about that. In America, during the 1700s, we began to see the presence of what were called almshouses for the poor and those who weren't caring for themselves. The types of relief, which is another term for assistance, could be seen in terms of two types: indoor and outdoor relief. Indoor relief was really institutional care, or people who were given homes, whereas outdoor relief was assistance for individuals in their own homes. Cash assistance is basically the most well-known form of outdoor relief. So indoor relief here was definitely the mode of intervention in the first 100 years or so of our nation's history, and even before that. So Of course, almshouses required some funding, and those communities that couldn't afford the funding engaged in activities like even auctioning off poor adults to private families, and children were apprenticed out to craftsmen and artisans and things like that. Potentially to learn a trade, which, in those days was a way of kind of saving the soul of a child, so that they didn't repeat the errors of the ways of their parents, so they would have some way to support themselves. But also, of course, it was of great benefit to the artisans and craftsmen and business people of the community because they got free labor essentially for in exchange for raising a child. By the end of the colonial period, the responsibility for the poor began to shift from the local communities to the larger colony or to the state, and so you begin to see larger governments beginning to intervene and getting involved on a somewhat limited basis, though, in the care of the indigent. And again, much like in England, there were oftentimes in the 1700s residency requirements and warning out being used by communities to deal with the problem of individuals moving about and coming to communities when they didn't belong to those communities. By the end of that century, able-bodied unemployed people were really put more in workhouses rather than almshouses, and so the sense of well, worthy and unworthy poor, there was more of a sense of expectation of the individuals who were getting the care of the communities provided to them, and so they were expected to provide labor in exchange for their care. And really, by the early 1800s, these workhouses became the primary mode of assistance. Now, an interesting thing also that developed during this period of time was, poor children, if they weren't apprenticed out, were sometimes put in almshouses, and there was concern by many individuals looking after them that they were being housed with individuals who were not good role models for them. And so the care of children began to separate out from the workhouses and almshouses, although work facilities did exist still for children. Now, I'll tell you something about that in a second. It's very interesting in my own history. But almshouses uh, and workhouses really were focused more upon adult care, and there were other forms of care. It was the earliest stages of foster care, among other things, began to develop for children during the 1800s. What I wanted to tell you in earlier in my career, I spent a number of years working at a children's facility in Orlando called Great Oaks Village, just now the Orange County Department of Children's Services, I believe, and was a very fine institution and had a rich history in Orange County. And in fact, the earliest name of that facility, stretching back into I believe the late 1800s, was the Orange County Poor Farm. And the children that were placed there, because the families weren't able to care for them or weren't taking care of them properly, were required to work in the fields and grow their own food. So of course, by the time I worked there, you really, if you had a kid in the facility wash your car, you were required to pay that child separately for that. You couldn't require him to work, and of course that's the way it should be. But it's interesting that even some of the facilities now, reach back into the period of time when even children were expected to work in exchange for their care. One person who, is famous from the early 1800s in America is Dorothea Dix, and she was appalled at the conditions of the care for the mentally ill in institutions, in almshouses and workhouses, and advocated for funding for the improved care for to improve the conditions for the care of the mentally ill, and actually succeeded in convincing Congress of this, and Congress set aside 10 million acres of federal lands to be sold, the proceeds of which would go for the improved care of the mentally ill. Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, vetoed that after it was passed, indicating essentially that he didn't think the federal government had a role in this, that if the federal government began to care for this population, there would be a lot of claims on federal money for others, and so he just felt it was inappropriate, and so that actually never came to fruition. But Pierce's veto really kind of held sway for, I mean, that was sort of the character of the federal approach to government, with a couple exceptions to federal approach to social welfare, well into the 20th century, except again for a few exceptions, which I mention here. One of them is Veterans Assistance and the Freedmen's Bureau, which was set up to help the African Americans who had been slaves and were given their freedom after the Civil War. Now, understand, this program is just not so much that it's altruism as it is a recognition that these freed African Americans had no means of supporting themselves necessarily and nowhere to go. Not unlike what was found at the end of the feudal system, and so in Europe, and so there was also a sense of protecting the economy and protecting the population and providing services for them. Veterans assistance, of course, after the Civil War, there were many injuries. It was interesting, although this isn't about the federal government, but I believe if you ever watch Ken Burns's series on the Civil War, which is an excellent series, he'll tell you that in the year after the end of the Civil War, it would be like 1866, that more than 50% of the entire budget of the state of Mississippi was devoted to, I believe, the replacement of limbs on for the soldiers that had fought on behalf of the Confederacy that lived in that state. So Veterans Assistance was established. The federal government actually acknowledged some debt and some commitment to those who had fought for the Union, and it established really some of the earliest ongoing federal assistance for any group back after the Civil War on behalf of the veterans. The Freedmen's Bureau was dissolved by Congress, 7 years after it was established, and that was after a couple other attempts to dissolve it earlier. Throughout the 1800s, most of social services were provided from voluntary organizations and associations, and eventually this became inadequate. There was a lot of confusion, some duplication of services, and in other places there were absence of services. And as the industrial era became firmly seated in our economy, the need for social services increased greatly as there was a migration of individuals from the farms to the cities. And this says in the 1930s, the text does, and there was certainly a large migration of individuals from rural to urban settings during that time. But this is something that started much earlier than that. If you read The Jungle, in fact, Sinclair writes about how many during labor strikes in the North, in Chicago, in that area, what the factory owners did was to import Southerners, and generally they were African American Southerners, to the North to serve as strike breakers, and some of the underlying resentment that seems to exist among Caucasians towards African Americans actually has some of its roots tied to those actions on behalf of the factories owners in those days. But that's just a small part of it, of course. But a little footnote in history there, that there were a lot of people moving from the cities, from the farms to the cities. Likewise, in the 30 years or so surrounding the turn of the last century, a great migration from northern and even more so southern and central Europe. This is when my father's family arrived on the shores of America. These kinds of things put a lot of pressure. Of course, most of them went to urban locations and not to rural areas, because it was expected there was work in the urban settings, and so this created a lot of pressures on the voluntary associations, and it became very inadequate in providing the social services that were needed. There were some improvements in the early 1900s, and this was really, Teddy Roosevelt by this time as president, and the progressive era, which we're going to touch on in a second, was beginning to get underway during that period of time, and so there was improvement for some protections for women in the workplace, in terms of the number of hours that they could be required to work. And understand, in America in those days, as well as even today, women are seen as the primary caretakers of the children. There was a movement to reduce the capitalists' capacity to take advantage of women's need to work by reducing the number of hours that they could be required to work, among some other protections as well. Also, there were some early movements towards child labor laws during that period of time and the establishment of compulsory education. Now, this occurs at the same time that there is a recession or maybe even a depression in our economy, and that had something to do with the strikes that was going on because people didn't feel they were being paid properly. There really weren't labor unions to speak of in those days. The earliest days of labor unions were back in that period of time, and individuals like Eugene V. Debs, advocated for workers and for worker unions and things. But the owners could really, do what they wanted with their employees, and so that meant low wages as well. And so one of the ways to assist in that was to get the children and even the women, to a certain extent, out of the workplace so that there were fewer people clamoring for jobs, which gave jobs to the men who were having trouble finding that work that was adequate pay and things. And so, once again, even though there's some social advances for women and children around the turn of the last century, it's not all entirely altruistic. It has a lot to do with the economy. And this is often the case with social welfare programs even today. 10 out of 12 workers affected by industrial accidents during that era, but there was no workers' compensation program, no disability insurance existed, so much less, health care insurance, health insurance, and if you got injured on the job, your family suffered if you couldn't work, and you were replaced by your employer immediately. Political machines really had a lot to do with the corruption that existed in the business world, and so one of the things that happened socially was the journalists like Upton Sinclair and others, called the muckrakers, began to write books and pieces that kind of called attention to the horrible problems of capitalism and what it was doing to the workers as well as to the general public. The Jungle is the book that I'm most familiar with from that period of time. I will say, by the way, I think Michael Moore's role, I may have told you this already, Michael Moore's role with his movies today, he's sort of a modern muckraker, and the anger that people feel towards him, particularly from the right, very much was the experience of the muckrakers 100 and some years ago as they were writing these books exposing the ills of society. Michael Moore's movies do that today. During the 1800s, it became the scientific era, and there was a desire to apply science and the procedures of science and the concepts of science to the human condition, thinking perhaps they could find a solution to things like poverty and vagrantisms and so on. And so what developed out of that was the social Darwinism, which we've already talked about, but the basic ideas of this, taking the Darwinian theory about the survival of the fittest, is that if competition for scarce resources is the law of nature, then the poor suffer because they're not capable of competing adequately. And likewise, if you are doing well, if you're wealthy or well off, then you're entitled to your spoils because you are fit. That applying the Darwinian theory. So that thought, therefore, is that aiding the poor and permitting their reproduction altered the laws of nature and weakened the human gene pool. And so it was seen that those individuals who were aiding the needy, or those programs that aided the needy, thwarts the evolutionary progress of humankind. So you can see that the early early underpinnings of disdain for social workers, and there are people who still kind of turn up their nose when they say the term social worker. This is where it comes from, basically. It totally irrelevant today, but nonetheless, that was the theory, and that's what there are still a lot of social Darwinistic undercurrents in social welfare policy and in the way people view the poor and the needy today. Religious institutions in it kind of relieved a little bit of that to a certain extent, but still treated poverty as a moral failure. Those that were providing services, the focus was to get the individuals right with God and get to work. Going back to the Calvinistic and Lutheran philosophies about work being related to morality, and so if you were successful, that's an indication of God's favor and uh, society. You should be working. If you're a moral person, you would be working, trying to earn God's favor. And so neglecting the poor thus gets some backing from the religious community. The earliest social workers out there were largely untrained, volunteer, middle and upper class women that were connected to a church. So they had the belief that the poor, because of their religious connections, their inclination was to believe that the poor needed to be taught to live moral lives, and that would therefore help them improve their situation. So much of the work of the early social workers focused upon spiritual guidance. And if there was any kind of cash assistance, any kind of concrete aid, and something that really was not favored by this group, then it would be tied to demands such as abstaining from alcohol, living a more proper life. There were a number of organizations, as I mentioned earlier, that were providing aid that wasn't always well coordinated, and there was sometimes duplicated, sometimes non-existent. There was a fair amount of graft and corruption in some of those organizations as well, and so the charity organization societies developed, around the 1870s or so, to coordinate the relief provided by these various agencies, and perhaps to provide some supervision or oversight over how the funds were used and to organize all of that. And the workers who went out from the COSs, were what we now call friendly visitors. I think they were called that then. Once again, I think an extension of those early social work. They may have been paid, but there was still a large religious, kind of moralistic kind of tenor to their involvement with clients. But one of the things they did was that, well, they were intended to get out there to investigate the causes of a poor person's poverty, their existence, and to try to instruct those poor in better ways to manage themselves. And again, they did not believe in, well, the term here is beneficent, I think, beneficent charity, because they thought it was counterproductive to just hand over money to people when they were in need, and that it did contribute to laziness and those kinds of things. And so again, it was about really moral advice and giving and those kinds of things. But almost in spite of themselves, they provided some of the data about poverty, and their data helped to prove in years later, helped to prove the fact that the poverty wasn't only about the moral failings of individuals, that it had a lot to do with what was going on with the economic system. Some of the earliest data about that came out of the COS investigations, even though they didn't intend it that way. I remember I told you that the care of children was kind of separated out from some of the issues with adults, and a lot of times, well, there was a lot of efforts made to remove children from these poor individuals, even though they might have been being taken care of perfectly adequately otherwise. And really, this continued well into the 1970s, and OCS, there is a very specific mention in our policy, which I wouldn't even think would have been necessary, or their policy. I don't work there anymore, but it says specifically that poverty is not a reason to remove a child from a family. It's not sufficient, it's not adequate. Perhaps that's in law in Alaska. But even into the 1970s and 1980s, really with the revision of the, and I'll talk about this, the revision of the Social Security Act in 1970 separated payments from services, where the individuals who certified a person for welfare assistance was not providing social services, and those providing social services would not provide payments. So when I started in the AFDC office in the mid 1970s, whenever I had a client who had a need, maybe assistance with their lights getting turned on or some other social service need other than their certification for public assistance, I had to refer them to the worker down the hall. It drove me crazy because I really wanted to provide, assistance to individuals, but my role was very specifically defined in those days. And that goes back to this period of time when children were being removed because of poverty, and people didn't approve of the lifestyle of the individuals, and again, it doesn't justify removal, but in those days and for a long time, kids were taken away from families because of that. And this was a part of that notion of child saving. The child saving movement was where orphans, well, children were called orphans. Some of them were living on the streets, but many of them were just removed from their families and sent west to help farmers. Of course, we were expanding west at the time, and once again, this was free labor for families that needed the labor and didn't have the funds to hire people. And children were sent out there theoretically, to improve their condition and to, get them out of the cities and away from all the bad influences of poverty and destitution there, and teach them how to work hard and earn a decent living and be a good soul. And the Children's Day Society, of course, continues today. They're much more enlightened than they were at the 100 years ago or so. But it's still an organization that's very very dominant around the United States and helps with the adoption of children. Now we've read about the settlement house movement, and you're familiar with it. And the interesting thing about the settlement house movement is that it really is a sort of a separate philosophy about social work that I think we're trying to find a way to bring back into the mainstream profession that we have. The settlement houses were established mostly in urban settings, and they tried to work across class differences. So again, you had a middle and upper income, largely women, moving into communities to assist those who were poor or marginally employed, let's say, or whatever. Many immigrant neighborhoods also, really a lot of work with immigrants to organize, provide adult education and literacy classes. Um, it was recognized even in those days the immigrants were being taken advantage of because they didn't know the language, and so there was English lessons and lessons about a lot of different kinds of things that were intended to help them be more effective in their community. Here you recognize that the difference here is that we're not talking about people who have a problem. We're helping people who are capable of learning and providing them with the skills needed to function effectively in this economy and in this society. It isn't, and it's not suggested through their interventions that there's anything wrong with these persons at all. It's a big difference. And so, from the COSs and that whole casework kind of philosophy. And the advantage, of course, since these workers were living right in the communities with the people they were serving, they got a lot of insight, a lot of knowledge into the economic conditions in American cities, and this provided really the foundation for the settlement house moving to be workers to really be advocates and very reform-minded individuals. They really worked at changing society, not changing people. The most famous is a Hull House in Chicago that Jane Addams established in 1889. I mean, but I think actually settlement houses had begun before Jane Addams came back. She had been in England for a number of years and brought that philosophy back from England, and that's what is the underpinning of Hull House. If you ever go to Chicago and you go up it used to be the Sears Tower. I think it's the Willis Tower now. And you're up there in the observation deck and you're looking, four different directions, of course, up there, and they have little maps at each direction. It tells you what's below what you're looking at. You'll find Hull House in I think it's the west direction, if I remember correctly. So, and Hull House, I believe, well, its services have largely closed fairly recently. It is still there as an historical site to visit. African American associations had to establish, because the social services that were available for individuals really largely were not available to African Americans. Now, this is, 40, 50 years after the end of the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau, went away in 1872. And so here we are, 30 some years after that, even if not longer. And we don't really have organizations that are serving African American individuals. And so what happened is a lot of mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations developed to provide for those individuals' needs as well. And interestingly, also there were organization of colleges, especially for rural African Americans, that continue to exist today. Morehouse College being one such example of that. Social reform organizations such as the Niagara Movement evolved into modern day organizations called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. The Urban League also had its roots back in these periods of time. So these were all organizations intended to help African Americans during this time. So the progressive era grows partly out of Teddy Roosevelt's reforms with the business community. He went after the corporations that were becoming very large and powerful, and very focused upon their own profit, to the demise of many businesses and individuals around them. And so he engaged in what was known as trust busting, breaking up those corporations and their web of self-owned industries that fed those corporations. And so from that really became more of a focus upon, well, for the first time, federal government is beginning to intervene in the work site. The Food and Drug Administration the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, I think intervenes and begins to inspect meat packing industries. Now that grows out of the jungle. That was the big result of that book being written by Upton Sinclair. Sinclair wanted his readers to understand the plight of the immigrant and why socialism was a better economic system. He really showed how capitalism, I think very effectively, how capitalism, just unbridled, unregulated capitalism, can grind down the worker and use them. And that's what he wanted the public to see. What the public saw, instead of it being their heart, I think I read one time it was their stomachs instead. They were appalled with the conditions that were described in the meat packing plants, and were worried about their own health. And so the regulations of the production of meat was established, and not a whole lot was done. There were some efforts made about the plight of the immigrants, but really how it affected the middle class was what really came out of the jungle. And Sinclair was very disappointed with that. But nonetheless, there were a lot of other muckrakers writing exposés about social conditions. Socialism was becoming very prominent in Europe during this period of time, and there were a lot of fears that socialism was going to get a strong foothold in America and perhaps upset the capitalist system and the political system that we had. We had socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs, I mentioned earlier. Actually, I think in 1916, might have been 1912. I forget the percentage he got, but it was the largest percentage of the vote for president that a socialist candidate ever got. Interestingly, he was put in jail during the Wilson administration because he was rabble-rousing, trying to keep America out of World War I at the time that Wilson was getting ready to put us in World War I. And he was put in jail. ran for president in the 1920 election, even though he was still in jail at the time. But a lot of people think, that was a political imprisonment more than anything else, even in our nation of freedom. Some shades of locker up, perhaps. I don't know. It's not the first time that's ever been brought up. After World War One, progressive ideas were treated very skeptically. I guess that's the right word. There were a lot of programs implemented during the progressive era. I mean, some of the states began to implement workers' compensation. Child labor laws had become more prominent. Those kinds of things, and there was some talk about family assistance during that period of time, widows' pensions, and that type of thing. But at the end of World War One, the tide kind of turned against this progressive movement, and liberals were, well, again, thinking about the fact that that socialism was making its way around the world. There were a lot of people who were very concerned about the liberals actually aiding and abetting socialism. The some of the immigrants, and this happens with Yurgis in the jungle. They hit the rails looking for work. So they jump on freight cars and ride the trains to another community and look for a job. And if they didn't get one there, they get on the rails again. Again, this is they were called hobos in those days. You might be a familiar term to you. So with the concern about liberals, those individuals who were supporting the expansion of benefits to workers, those kinds of things, the social work profession began to be associated with socialism as well. And there was a great deal of mistrust about the reformers that were trying to change society and turn it into more of a socialist kind of a system. Doesn't that sound familiar to you today? And so what happened is, in order because social work was trying to establish itself as a profession at the time, in order to preserve the professional integrity, let's say, of social work, what social work did was kind of focus more upon the casework model rather than a reform model of intervention for individuals. Mary Richmond wrote the first social work text, in fact, in 1919 called Social Diagnosis, and it really kind of established the basis for casework. And as you can see here, the Milford Conference in 1923 also gave an outline for casework agencies that said, you establish these agencies in the community, and they should be responding to the needs of the community, rather than kind of establishing their own values, let's say. But this is sort of the model for human service delivery that really existed for a long, long time. And this is where I think you'll find that the professional nature of social activism and social reform kind of broke off from social work, and to this day, our much of our training still focuses upon the medical model and individual treatment and intervention, with DSM diagnoses and this kind of thing. And so reform, if you get involved in social activism, and there's a lot of opportunities for that, you're not going to get paid as much as if you're a clinical worker. So we're looking for ways, I think, to kind of bring reform and activism into the clinical model, and I think we're making some strides in that respect. But that's just an interesting little aside for you about the development of our profession. Once the Depression hit, of course, the backlash against the progressive era suffered pretty greatly, and all of a sudden individuals who had never imagined themselves to be in need of assistance or help all of a sudden found themselves in breadlines and out of work. Herbert Hoover, who really was quite a humanitarian, had helped to reconstruct Europe, I believe, after World War I, and I think he had been the Secretary of Commerce before he was elected. Hoover believed strongly in the individual, responsibility piece of our American values, and supported voluntary organizations take care of the needs of human beings, but really didn't want to intervene on a government level when the Depression hit and serious economic problems became the norm for American families. Instead, his focus was upon relief of businesses and helping them to get back up on their feet. It didn't take long for the voluntary sector's funds to become exhausted as well. And the economy was collapsing. Franklin Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, and well, first of all, established some in the first 100 days. I think his administration is famous for what it achieved in its first 100 days, and now you hear about them always talking about what happened in the first 100 days of this presidency. That goes back to the Roosevelt era because he set a bar pretty high. He immediately declared a bank holiday. There was concern about the safety of funds. People were rushing, trying to get their money out of the bank because they thought the banks were going to would lose their money, and so he closed the banks to kind of calm down the fears, that banks can't be closed for more than 3 days at a time. Have you ever noticed that? They can't close over the 4-day Thanksgiving weekend. They have to open up on Friday, and some of that goes back to this. But in any event, eventually and not too far later, I think the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, was established that provided a guarantee that the federal government would insure up to I think it was $5,000 at the time. It's so much higher than that now, of any savings account in a bank. So that people didn't have to worry that they wouldn't have their money, and because of course if everybody drew their money out of the banks, the system for supporting businesses would collapse in our economy. He also, in his first 100 days or so, established these organizations, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, to provide relief to states and local communities, really to give them money to help individuals that needed assistance, and the National Industrial Recovery Act to provide public works projects and merely to kind of make the federal government an employer to put people to work. Now, and also establishing some control over the federal work site, trying to manage what happened with the federal with work sites and what employers could require and those kinds of things. Now, the Supreme Court, within a short amount of time, came back and declared parts, if not all, of both of these laws unconstitutional. His efforts to get the economy back up on its feet was torn asunder by a conservative court. He was actually developed a strategy. He was going to, what they called court packing. He was going to ask Congress to create 4 new Supreme Court decisions, or positions rather. So instead of having 9 justices, there would be 13. And of course, his intent would be to pack the court with 4 people of his own party and his own inclination. But that was never successful. But this is one of the reasons why he wanted to do it, because he felt the court was stopping him from rescuing the country. So Phyllis Day refers to it as the second New Deal, but the programs that we know of as the New Deal involved a whole hodgepodge of different kind of programs. A lot of people call them the alphabet soup. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was involved in the refinancing of homes, or to assist individuals in getting new mortgages. The AAA was intended, the Agriculture Adjustment Act was to provide funds to farmers so that they could limit their production and thus prop up farm prices, but also to distribute surplus foods to the needy so that farm prices could be stabilized. FDIC, we had talked about that, ensuring deposits made in banks. National Youth Authority provided jobs for young Americans in school and college. And the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, hired men ages, and granted, there's certainly a chauvinistic, there's still a lot of focus upon men in the workforce during this era. Hired men aged 18 to 25 to engage in conservation activities around the nation. Some of our national parks, our most famous national parks, I believe, including Great Smoky National Park, have a lot of the resources they have because of this of the CCC guys working on them. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, funding for skilled and educated individuals to be employed in various projects. And this was everything from construction and infrastructure work all the way up to, well, you can tell, music and art. And you know, murals being painted and concerts being developed and written and things like that. I mean, employed all sorts of different kinds of people paid by the federal government. I I can remember in East Lansing at Michigan State where I went to school, and I'm sure there was probably some at Florida State too, where I also went to school. I can remember some WPA buildings on campus. Some of the older buildings is just as sturdy as, I mean, they'll be there another 100 years from now, I'm sure, and beautiful, some very beautiful buildings in many respects. So this all comes out of WPA. And notice here the federal government is taking responsibility for relieving poverty and relieving the spoils of the economic system here. I mean, what it's done. This is a major change. This is really where Franklin Pierce's veto of the million or the 10 Million Acre Act kind of ended. That philosophy about government intervention ends with FDR's programs here. And of course, the Social Security Act, which is the thing we remember the most. By the way, I may be telling you this later, but WPA, well, it does say this here, was the alternative to the National Industrial Recovery Act. They did some things with the original proposal and developed as WPA. I think it was without all of the control over the work sites, which was, I think, the big thing that took NIRA into court. They got that out of there and just focused upon providing jobs for people with the WPA. FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which was also declared unconstitutional, was reshaped and revised as the Social Security Act of 1935, providing benefits to workers and families. And now, as much as the New Deal did for rescuing the economy from the problems that were developed because of the collapse of the capitalist system in America, understand that this did not, none of this introduced huge change in our economy. None of this moved us away from a capitalist model. And in fact, much of the model in the New Deal continues to provide support to prop up the capitalist system, which of course had a lot to do with the collapse of the economy to begin with, but the capitalist system continues to be supported and propped up through the New Deal. It isn't a major change in terms of our economic system, although it does talk about the federal government intervention in the economic system. And so the reforms in the workplace were brought about through separate legislative acts, including the Wagner Act in 1935, which established the National Labor Relations Board and the right to gave workers the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established a standard work week, and anything over 44 hours, at that time it's now 40, of course, and 37 and a half in some jobs in Alaska. And actually, not just Alaska. It's also the case in Orange County, Florida, where I first worked. It was a 37-hour work week as well. But anyway, over this limit, the workers are required to be paid overtime. Now, that only applies to businesses that are subject to federal regulation. That has something to do with the size and where their products go and those kinds of things. Unfortunately, it doesn't protect everybody. But the idea of the standard work week with time and a half for overtime or whatever, came out of the Fair Labor Standards Act. The minimum wage and the FLSA, by the way, continues to be enforced. Of course, so does the right to strike. But when individuals feel as though they're being required to work without pay or something like that, or not giving adequate pay, they can sue their employer under the FLSA. minimum wage, the first minimum wage established, and formally child labor was outlawed on a national level under this. Limits were placed upon when children could work at what age and what else had how many hours and those kinds of things. And also, largely through the states, the workers' compensation was becoming widespread throughout the world or throughout the nation as well. So if you're injured on the job, you had something to support you. Now, the Social Security Act, again, the sort of the crowning achievement of the New Deal. There are three main parts to this: federal insurance for workers, federal to state categorical assistance, and maternal and child welfare. And just briefly touching on what each of these parts are. The federal insurance for workers, the old age and survivors insurance. Survivors actually were added in 1939. This is your Social Security retirement program. And originally it was just for the worker. They added children's benefits for retired workers in 39. In 1956, under the Eisenhower administration, the Social Security Act was extended to include disability. So if you're disabled, you could apply for Social Security benefits. And in 65, Medicare, that medical insurance, was added as well under Lyndon Johnson's administration. So really, Social Security has evolved over the years. Unemployment compensation. And by the way, originally the intent was, I believe, that that this was going to be sort of a self-insurance program for workers. Of course, with the baby boom, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. There are fewer active workers contributing, and there are more retirees now, so that it's really kind of unbalanced the financial viability of Social Security. I would just tell you, and I think our studies are going to show this later on, don't believe everything you hear about how the Social Security system is going to go broke. There are a number of things that are going on that can be changed and can fix that. I'll just leave that at that. Unemployment compensation also was established so that if you are laid off from work, that you are entitled to some benefits for a period of time. Federal to state categorical assistance. Old age assistance for those individuals who, in order to qualify for the federal social insurance for workers, you have to contribute to the Social Security Fund over, I think it's 40 quarters, a significant amount of money over 40 quarters or 10 years. Once you've done that, then you're eligible for Social Security retirement. But if you retire, you're not working, and you haven't contributed to the Social Security system for that amount of time, you would be eligible for old age assistance in those days, which of course, provided much less. And in fact, the amount of money you received, because this is federal to state assistance, federal government giving the states money, the states could set the amount that you received. Okay, and so if you lived, for instance, in New York State, you got a lot more money than if you lived in Mississippi. Likewise for the blind and for dependent children. Now, in a moment, we'll get back to ADC, but aid to the blind, the permanently and totally disabled was added. Medicaid was added in 61. And in 1974, this old age assistance and aid to the blind and disabled was federalized under a revision of the Social Security Act and became SSI, Supplemental Security Income. One of the things that was happening because of the disparity in what the states were paying individuals, the federal government wanted to ensure that the state, whatever the state wasn't providing to meet the basic needs of life, the feds would make up with a supplemental income payment, and that's where SSI comes from. Since that time, this isn't a totally national program. The states aren't deciding rates of payment any longer, but this is where SSI comes from. So if you're receiving SSI disability, what this implies is that as opposed to Social Security disability, the implication is that you didn't contribute into the Social Security system long enough to qualify for Social Security disability. And certainly SSI funds are much more limited than Social Security disability funds are. Okay, then aid to dependent children. now called TANF. This is what you typically think of when you think of welfare, or what most of the public thinks of as welfare, at least. Initially, we're going to touch on a little thing about this, but initially this was just for the children in a family where there wasn't sufficient income. Okay, in 1950, during the Truman administration, the caretaker was added to this grant, so it became AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and then well, it was renamed Aid to Families with Dependent Children in '62, and after welfare reform during the Clinton era in the '90s, it became Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. In Alaska, it's ATAP, Alaska Temporary Assistance Program. Now, the states did and continue to have control over how much money is paid out, and so you're as a ATAP worker or ATAP recipient, you're going to receive a great deal, and I do mean great deal is a relative statement, but you receive more in Alaska than you would say if you lived in Alabama, for instance, because it's still controlled by the states. And then finally, the maternal and child welfare provision of the Social Security Act provided for the care of homeless, dependent, and neglected children. Focused, again, homeless, dependent, neglected. You don't hear anything about abuse in here because really child abuse still wasn't recognized. And in fact, it was the 1960s, before child protection itself began to be identified as a separate entity. Children who were abused a lot of times weren't protected, and there's a number of different reasons for that, and I think we'll probably touch on that later in the semester. But they just weren't protected, and here again, we're looking at children who aren't being cared properly or living in poor families, and mind you, the AFDC workers, the caseworkers that are providing eligibility are the ones who are making decisions about whether the home is fit. They could remove children because there was an unmarried man living in the home with a mother. They would make midnight raids into homes, and check for cigarette butts in the ashtray if it wasn't the mother's cigarettes, and look in closets to see if there were shoes belonging to men. I mean, these things happened, and I read case records where my supervisor provided or participated in raids like that at different times when I worked in AFEC in Florida years ago. I also provide for crippled children services and other health programs. I believe public health programs to grow out of this act. So anyway, that's a very superficial look at the Social Security Act, and I hope we get a chance to come back to that later. But two footnotes to this. First of all, the ADC program, the Aid to Dependent Children program, its original intent was to be a program that was designed to allow mothers to stay home and care for their children rather than work. That was the original intent of this program when this act was developed. But there was an outcry about caring for people who weren't working it got put in the Department of Labor as for administration at the time, and so the focus became the unemployed mother, not the children who were the intended beneficiaries of this program. So just understand, this is allow mothers to stay home and care for the children rather than work. We've lost that concept if we ever had it. And what's missing? Of course, universal health care. And there were early indications that universal health care would be a part of the Social Security Act. The American Medical Association lobbied against it very forcefully and managed to get it taken out of the Social Security Act. Years later, the AMA, along with other forces, lobbied against the efforts on the behalf of the early Clinton administration to implement a national health insurance program as well. After World War II, gosh, another scare about socialism, although this was a communist scare, the Red Scare it was called. and it resulted in once again in the repression of the progressive reforms that were going on during the New Deal years, and really AFDC and Social Security have seen expansion since then, but there have been virtually no new welfare programs since that really offered for many years after that. And of course, Social Security and public assistance through TANF are constantly being picked apart by administrations that are not in favor of providing that assistance. And so, who knows how much of that's going to survive in the long run. You read, I hope, a little section out of Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, because there was this myth developed during the prosperity of the 50s that America well, we were just unsurpassed in our riches, and that all Americans were doing well. And he exposed the subculture of poverty in America that existed in many parts around the nation. And something that people didn't want to see, but it had something to do with the development of a new progressive movement during the Kennedy and Johnson years. There was some progress in terms of civil rights also, in the 1950s. Really, both the civil rights movement involved both African Americans and women for a long period of time, and I believe it was during World War II when women were put to work in the factories when the men were overseas. Women began to recognize they didn't need men to support themselves if they didn't know it before. I mean, but as a group, it was known that women could support themselves and work and be effective in the industrial market and things like this. And I think for a period of time, the women's involvement in the civil rights movement died out. African Americans continued to suffer from discrimination. They were always the last hired, first fired kind of experiences, and so they moved forward in the civil rights movement. So in the early 1950s, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, the Supreme Court under Earl Warren ruled that overturned the ruling of the Supreme Court in 1896. Plessy versus Ferguson, if you want to know. Plessy said that separate facilities were fine as long as they were equal. And in 1954, in the Brown ruling, the court said separate by definition cannot be equal. And so this resulted in the order to the court for the desegregation of schools, which of course was a very, very, very slow process. One of the things that all of these court rulings and congressional actions we're going to talk about in the next few slides show is that the law can change, but that doesn't mean necessarily the practice changes. So you have de jure, which means by law, and you have de facto, which means by fact. And de facto segregation, de jure segregation were two entirely different things. More recent court rulings have undermined some of the progress that was established in the 50s and 60s and 70s in the area of civil rights, but we'll touch on that in a moment. The women's rights movement became more active again in the 60s. I think one of the big prompts for that was the ready availability of the birth control pill. It's a whole lecture in sociology for me about how our society changed as women could also separate, like men can, sexuality from pregnancy. And for the first time, women, recognized they had control over their bodies, and it could be that. Well, again, a sociology discussion I don't have time to get into here, but I think this is one of the prompts for the resurgence of the women's rights movement, and the patriarchal structure of the family life was becoming challenged finally in that era. So during Lyndon Johnson's Kennedy's administration ended abruptly with his assassination, and Lyndon Johnson picked up the gauntlet of some of the things Kennedy started, but most of this really was Johnson's push. The Democratic Party changed greatly. The South really moved away from the Democratic Party, became a much more Republican party because of the fact that the South resisted. Many of the Southern states and institutions resisted this push for equality and civil rights. Now, you see, there were a lot of attempts to alleviate poverty through Johnson's War on Poverty or the Great Society. And there's a number of agencies listed there. You'll notice mostly education and employment oriented. So again, we're really looking at putting people to work and as a solution to poverty in an economy that requires 1 in 5 people or 1 in 20 people to be out of work when they want to work. But there are also some things like the Legal Services Agency, which was intended to provide representation for poor people in situations such as landlord-tenant problems and things like that. Lost its federal funding after some time when the feds discovered that most of the lawsuits that these young attorneys were bringing on behalf of poor people was against the federal government, and so the federal funds began to get pulled back from that. But some more enlightened local communities have legal services, legal aid societies funded by the local organizations. The intent of Johnson's programs was to enlist the maximum feasible participation of the poor, but a lot of those programs failed because of corruption in local politicians, ineffective leadership, uncooperative bureaucrats. Although, as this slide points out, the percentage of people living in poverty fell from 25% at the beginning of that decade to 12% by the end of the decade. So there's definitely some improvement there. Aside from the Johnson administration's efforts to establish programs to change poverty, legislation and Supreme Court rulings in the 60s gave more promise for expanded civil rights, including the very famous Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or national origin, including voter registration, including schools and the workplace. And I believe it gave the federal government the right to withdraw federal funds if organizations didn't comply. So it really put some teeth in the enforcement of this. Voting Rights Act of 1965 cut down barriers preventing African Americans from voting that were existent, particularly in the South, including such things as literacy tests and poll taxes and things like this. There was some states had a rule that you could vote only if your grandparents could vote. And, well, of course, that means that many African Americans were not able to vote. So the Voting Rights Act changed this. And parts of this were struck down by the court in 2013, unfortunately. It had more to do with the monitoring of states who had a history of denying voting rights. And, we've been hearing in the news about some indications that perhaps some states still need monitoring. Medicare and Medicaid established, food stamp program established as a program of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Again, while it helps people that have fewer dollars coming in, it also assists farmers because it puts more money into the market to buy food, and it helps to reduce surplus production. The food stamp program, now called SNAP, replaced the subsidy or I'm starting to work as this is getting so long. I'm forgetting my words. It replaced the program where foodstuffs were given to individuals rather than allowing them a selection of food, so like large cans of peanut butter and pork and things like this. And the word is just slipping my mind, but anyway, food stamp program, now SNAP, established during this period of time to help the farmers as much as it is to help poor people. Commodities, that's the word I'm looking for. It replaced the commodities program. Older American Acts of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which extended prohibitions against discrimination to housing, which Martin Luther King's group demonstrated in Chicago, among other places, of its existence. More amendments to the Social Security Act, the separation of services and payments is one of them. The attachment of the cost of living increases, COLAs were kind of, attached to Social Security, so that elderly people were not left behind by cost of living increases, and so on. Mental Health Act was established in the early 60s that helped to provide funding for, well, first of all, for social work education and also for the establishment of community mental health centers, trying to deinstitutionalize the care of the mentally ill and get them out into the community. Several Supreme Court decisions were also, again, in the Warren Court, that was noted to be a liberal court, to extend the rights of individuals, including the Miranda ruling in 1966. You all know what that means. The Galt decision, which extended civil rights to juveniles who were in the legal system, gave them essentially the same rights as adults. They didn't have that before. The courts could put kids away for shoplifting for years and years and years, when for an adult they would, get a slap in the wrist. And so that Galt changed that. Loving versus Virginia, where it was states were prohibited from outlawing interracial marriages. It's a very interesting story behind this, and in fact, there was a movie I think in 2017 called Loving that is sort of a dramatization of this, and it's worth watching. And of course, Roe v. Wade in 1973 that guaranteed abortion rights, being chipped away at by our leaders every day. We're getting close to the end here, so I'm almost done. I'm very sensitive to the fact that I don't want to tie up your time too long, and it's kind of silly because I know that you can stop this and go back to it at any time, but there's just so much information here, and there's such interesting history. I could take any of these slides and talk for an hour on them, but anyway, so since the Johnson era, we didn't even have a war this time, but we had a retreat from the progressive changes. Perhaps the war that we had was within the nation itself, because as the civil rights legislations were passed, all those laws were passed, and court rulings were established, de facto was very different from de jure, and many persons became very, very frustrated with the lack of progress, and in some respects the cities began to explode. Watts, Newark, Detroit also dramatic riots and whole sections of the city being destroyed by persons, and it was in that, plus the Vietnam War. We were getting mired down deeper and deeper in that with little progress, and people were beginning to become very unhappy with our involvement there. Lyndon Johnson was voted, well, he decided not to run again in 1968 because he knew he was going to be voted out. In 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in April. Bobby Kennedy, who was running for president and really offered some hope for change, was assassinated in June of that year. If you get Netflix, watch, there's a short series called Bobby Kennedy for President that is an exceptional documentation of Bobby Kennedy's political career and the promise that he was bringing to America at the time. But anyway, a lot of things going on in 1968 after the riots, and there was concern with both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy's assassination of further riots, and I think there were some. But that year, Richard Nixon's elected president on a law and order platform, and while he's vowing us to getting us out of Vietnam, it takes another, 6 years, I think, for that to happen, and actually another president before we finally pull out. And so the push now is to shift funding for social services from the federal government to the states. It started under Nixon, accelerated under Ronald Reagan. Nixon did have a proposal for a basic family income program. It would have been the first I think, national standard for family income. but Congress wouldn't approve it. Now Nixon was a Republican and isn't known for being a liberal by any stretch of the imagination. But this is the traditional conservatives that we're talking about here, which had more of a liberal leaning than the conservative section of the political spectrum. Many segments of it, at least, have today. But there was a lot of concern that the family assistance, the bottom limit for income was considered to be too low, and those kinds of things. So the attacks on this came from both sides of the aisle. Reagan's policies were, very deeply connected to trickle down theories of economics, and during this period of time, the moral majority became very dominant. This was a very politically powerful religious leaders that were influencing the leadership of our nation, and this is where I think the cultural conservatism that we talked about in the previous chapter has its roots. Well, maybe not its roots, but its more modern day roots at least. But during this period of time, as more and more funds are shifted back to the states and block grants and away from federal involvement, we see an increase in homelessness all over the United States. The real income falling and industrial jobs being lost as the service sector begins to become more engaged. Now, remember, in industry, in large part, was unionized, and so as the industrial sector becomes less dominant, a lot of people who were making decent incomes, the blue collar workers, can't make that kind of income in service industries, much of which is not unionized. Skipping over George H.W. Bush, actually we've skipped past Ford as well, but with Bill Clinton, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act in 1996, not alphabet soup, it was alphabet jumbo prorora. I've seen it, I've seen the initials used, brought about the promised end of welfare as we know it. Clinton talked about that, I think, in 1992. He promised the end of welfare as we know it. And they really did bring this about in a lot of ways. Although when he signed the act, he said he was doing so reluctantly, but that more or less Congress pushed a lot of this stuff on him he didn't want. And really, I think it was 1994. Clinton was elected in 92 in midterm elections, not unlike our most recent midterm elections. The party out of control got control in the House. The new Speaker of the House of Representatives was Newt Gingrich, who certainly was not inclined to be considerate of the needy and of family systems and things like this. He proposed his comment during this period of time was that if families couldn't take care of their children, meaning that we had to give them AFTC payments, then put the kids in orphanages and put them somewhere where somebody can take care of them if the family isn't financially adequate. Now, he actually said that. I remember a Time magazine issue about orphanages as a result of that. And of course, let's set aside the morality of such a thing and the harm that would do to children, and talk about the finances. It's so much cheaper to provide a basic level of assistance to keep children in the home with their parents than it would be to institutionalize children. Set aside all the other issues with that. But that was his solution, and that Congress passed a very punitive plan called the Contract with America, which was intended to cut back on entitlements and get people to work and reform our welfare system. And so the welfare reform in the mid 90s came after that, and to a certain extent, Bill Clinton really probably did have to push things into his plan that he didn't intend to because of that. Early in the Clinton administration, also there was an attempt to pass a comprehensive health care reform. He appointed his wife, Hillary Clinton, to lead that charge, and she went all over the nation meeting with leaders and everything like this, and there was intense lobbying that got that defeated probably before it ever got off the ground. I believe that a lot of the hostility that that has been exhibited towards Hillary Clinton in the last election and prior to that time arises from this period of time. I think, I got the sense listening to people when she was leading this effort back in the early 90s that people just thought, you know, what's a woman doing out there trying to change our lifestyle? It was some, I mean, really a lot of misogynistic, just misogynistic thinking about her being too bossy, I guess, and too active. And so it's sad, but I believe true. Clinton signed the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy, which essentially said that if you're gay and in the military, just don't say anything. We won't ask you about it. But it still allowed the military to kick gays out if they were discovered. Now that's since been revised and changed. The Defense of Marriage Act was signed in also during the Clinton administration. Eventually, as you know, overturned. I think the act is Obergefell in 2012 or 13. I think overturned by the Supreme Court that allows same-sex marriage across the nation. Now, DOMA was signed by Clinton. Once again, he says he was compromising, and that at the time, and this is true, there was a big movement afoot by the cultural conservatives to have Congress propose and pass a constitutional amendment sent out to the states that would institutionalize marriage as between a man and a woman, one man and one woman. And Clinton, since this time, in more recent years, has maintained that he signed that bill because he knew that if he vetoed it, first of all, it had been passed by a veto-proof Congress, and so vetoing it would only result in Congress overriding his veto. But that also, as the nation's leader, if he vetoed it, he was concerned that it was going to just further empower this movement to propose this new constitutional amendment that would deny rights to, for essentially forever for gays and lesbians to marry. And so this was a compromise. Now, a lot of people think Clinton was too centrist and really kind of gave up on a lot of the causes that he might have been able to advance. But he managed to stay in power for 8 years against many odds at different times. And while Barack Obama stayed in power for 8 years, also, the complaints about Obama was that he wasn't willing to compromise and that he lost a lot of his own what he might have pushed through because he didn't lead a charge that would challenge Congress. Now that's open for debate. But I've heard that said, and touch on that here in 1 second. Now, the George W. Bush campaign, one of the things that it did was it took advantage of that national concern about, that national push for one man, one woman in marriage, and engendered a lot of interest and concern about that in various states around the nation, both that and in terms of DOMA and any LGBTQ rights issues, so that those things wound up on state and local ballots. And what that did is it resulted in more of those cultural conservatives coming out to the polls in order to make sure that those things didn't pass. And of course, that helped George W. Bush against Al Gore and John Kerry in his two elections. As you know, Gore had more popular votes than Bush, but Bush got the votes in the states that counted, and so in 2000, so he became president. So it was apparent that they were manipulating the voting public in many respects. Then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated the federal budget during the Bush years, and so any efforts that he might have had towards social programming were really kind of undermined by the fact that there wasn't any money left for it. But he did support faith-based organizations providing services, and that was his response to, his father's 1,000 Points of Light program, from a few decades before. So Barack Obama was elected in 2008, of course, our first African American president. And certainly, the administration as a whole had a progressive flavor to it. Many people felt that more could have been done, but Barack Obama was not known for his willingness to sit down with Congress and to negotiate. And of course, Congress was extremely uncooperative with him as well. And in fact, from the very first day of his first Congress, the leadership of the Republican Party strategized to make him a one-term president by refusing to pass anything that he proposed. And this is on record. It's in history. Mitch McConnell and his crew. And so in all fairness, it was going to be very difficult for Obama to get many of his programs passed, and a lot of times he had to appeal to the American public and also to executive orders and things like that in order to accomplish things because of that. But some of the things that the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which provided women more time to file for equal pay suits if they found out later on that they were not paid the same amount as men. The bailouts of Wall Street and the auto industry, many think probably saved the economy during the Great Recession of 2008 and after, the years after that, and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which is the stimulus package to spur on construction and different kinds of things like that. He did manage to appoint, and I didn't mention this in this slide, but he appointed two left-leaning women to the Supreme Court, and Elena Kagan and pressure. I can't think of her name. Sonia Sotomayor. However, late in his administration, as you know, he appointed a moderate candidate for the Supreme Court to fill the vacancy left by a conservative judge, Scalia, upon his death, and Congress refused to vote on it for well over a year, waiting for his term to end and hoping that, against hope, I would say at the time, hoping against hope that a conservative was going to get elected president. But the signature change that came about during the Obama administration is the Affordable Care Act being signed into law in 2010 that included Medicaid expansion. Now, the Affordable Care Act is far less than perfect. A lot of people complain about the fees that are still attached with that, and that has to do with the fact that it depends upon the private insurance industry who are still pursuing profit, and this shouldn't discourage anyone from considering national health insurance, because it's not national health insurance, it's not universal health care, it's not single payer insurance, whatever you want to call it. This still relies upon private industry to offer reasonable rates in markets where there's very little competition. And the last I heard for Alaska, for instance, that there's only one insurance company in the quote unquote market, which, competition is the thing that keeps prices down. So once again, it's the capitalist system that is undermining ACA. It's not the ACA itself. But some of the mentality in the nation has changed with the passage of this, where now people are beginning to expect the government to support certain kind of healthcare coverage, like coverage for pre-existing conditions and those kinds of things, and so it has changed the health insurance industry institutionally speaking, and it may have I think eventually it's going to lead to a national health insurance program. I think it's inevitable, and even in our nation. In the Trump years, there have been, of course, efforts to scrap or at least to undermine the Affordable Care Act as much as possible, and it's been persistent and will continue. Some of the conservative courts are beginning to support that undermining, which is not surprising, given that the administration's appointments to the federal courts, including the two Supreme Court justices, have focused upon increasing conservative judges, and mind you, they're in lifetime appointments. So these appointments are going to be making rulings that will impact us for a couple of generations. Trump administration has been supportive of states' efforts to restrict or complicate access to abortion, and I believe personally that the intent of these restrictions and complications is to get it before the United States Supreme Court, hoping that the more conservative court will overturn Roe versus Wade. Don't be surprised. There have been attempts to pull back requirements for the provision of free birth control for employees that were established under the Obama administration. Court rulings have denied that. The rollbacks of Obama-era environmental regulations, and I did not list here. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and put it on the slide that will remain after this recording. Also, the restrictions on immigration, which have been a constant issue, including the construction of the wall since this administration came into power. So that is a thumbnail sketch of the ups and downs in American social welfare history. And I just will close this with a quotation from Jane Addams, who said she believed that, now this is our reformer, right? This is the reformer, the settlement house person. The social work profession must decide whether it is to remain behind in the area of caring for the victimized, or whether to press ahead into the dangerous area of conflict, where the struggle must be pressed to bring to pass an order of society with few victims. Sort of like the last lecture where they talked about, having good social programs isn't any kind of replacement for social justice. And that's what she's telling us. And so that's it. And thank you for sticking with me for so long. I hope this was useful to you. I think there's a lot of information for you to process here. So goodbye for now.